Thank you.
All right, so thank you all for coming back together to continue reviewing these draft chapters. So tonight we are going to go through Chapter 5, Subdivision Standards, Chapter 9, Access and Mobility Standards, Chapter 10, Sign Standards, and Chapter 11, the Floodplain Development Standards. We'll really quickly go through the project process since we just went over it all just last week. We won't spend too much time on that, and then we'll jump straight into our discussion. So just a reminder on our scope of work here, we are in task 5, and once this meeting is wrapped up, we will be moving squarely into task 6, the approval procedures, where we will be developing the nonconformities standards, administrative procedures, and definitions. So this will be the last kind of chunk of chapters that we present to you all before we take all of the feedback that we've received from this group, refine all of the draft chapters, and bring them back to you guys to take a final look at before we begin the outreach process. Okay, so getting started with the subdivision standards overview. So this chapter, the purpose is really to ensure that when subdivisions occur in the community, they are orderly, they facilitate further re-subdivision of land when that's appropriate, make sure that we are connected to all of the city services, so sewer, water, we're protecting environmental resources, and just making sure everything is accurate and to the recording standards of the city and the county. So in this section, we have had everything reviewed and refined with the input of the engineering staff of the city. So some of the changes to some existing language were based off of the feedback that they provided. But generally, it's very consistent with what you all have today, with the exception of these 3 chapter sections that just went in bold here. So street segments and lots, street design, and conservation design. So those 3 sections we're going to go into in more detail. So before we get into that, I want to go over the applicability of this chapter. So this chapter would apply in minor subdivision and major subdivision cases. We are not changing the definition of a major subdivision or a minor subdivision from what your code delineates today. But a minor subdivision is a subdivision that's along a public street, doesn't involve any opening, widening, or extending of any road, and doesn't involve more than 5 lots, the creation of more than 5 lots. And then a major subdivision is any subdivision that doesn't meet these standards. So it either isn't along a public street, is requiring the opening, widening, or extending of a road, or will result in more than 5 lots. And for a lot of the standards that we'll be going over, for the new standards, those would apply in those major subdivision cases. So the first proposed change we wanted to present to you all is about the street segments and lots. So we are proposing to update what you currently refer to as blocks to the term street segments. In the past, the term block has led to some confusion, some perhaps application of the standards that really weren't as they were intended to be applied. So we're hoping that the new term street segments and the definition that we'll provide for it will help improve clarity in those circumstances. We are also proposing to lower the maximum and minimum length of a residential street segment. And this is really to ensure that future neighborhoods in Stow, future major subdivisions, are more connected and they're more walkable. The shorter the block, the easier it is for a pedestrian to navigate. We have an example here on the screen where Bradford Way, that segment between Goodland Drive and Mayflower Lane, is at 1,400 feet, where we have Eastham Way between Miles Standish Lane and Carver Lane at about 1,000 feet. So we are proposing that the maximum length be at 1,000 feet, so that street segment of Eastham Way, which would then have Bradford Way no longer complying with those standards. So Bradford Way would not become non-conforming. It would not impact existing streets in any way, but moving forward for new subdivisions, for new major subdivisions, the street segment length would be more like what you see there on Eastham Way. And then we are also proposing, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
We are also proposing to reduce the minimum length, which is currently 800 feet, down to about 350 feet, again, just to promote walkability. And then currently, you do not have a maximum or minimum length for non-residential street segments. So we are proposing to carry forward a maximum length of 1,800 feet and a minimum length of 600 feet for non-residential street segments.
And real quick, just to clarify, this is in response to the blocks, what we went through with Miller's Landing. There's a lot of, different definitions that we're flying around about what a block really means. So this just further clarifies that, takes care of that issue. And this would only apply to local streets. So this wouldn't necessarily apply to, arterial street or a collector, where it wouldn't make much sense to have a maximum distance between streets.
How long is Miller's Landing, that road?
So between North River Road and the paper street up north is like 1,700 feet.
Okay.
So it complies with what it is today. It's approved. It'll become a non-conforming street with the new code.
So what would they have had to do under this code?
Under this code, they would have had to have some connecting street, or some type of turnaround at 1,000 feet length. So it would significantly alter the plan.
Right. And I'm not quite sure what that achieves. I mean, that's a long and narrow strip of land, and this one happens to have that connection to the north, right?
Yeah.
Where there could potentially, it would expand. But if you didn't have that, then I guess, whether that road was 1,200 feet or 1,400 feet, to me, I mean, it has no place to connect to.
Yeah.
So
in that case, they could apply for a variance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
but we're building a code
Right.
that we're automatically saying, oh, well, then we go apply for a variance on it that don't know if it's achieving the goals of rewriting the code. And I'm not sure if, an industrial section of maximum length of 1,800 feet makes sense either.
That's existing.
Is it?
Yeah. The 1,800 and 600 feet.
I mean,
They're the same between whether it's non-residential or residential. It's both the same. Or the residential, the minimum length was 800. The intent of bringing it down to 350 is, we're considering the lot sizes and what the typical length of an R2 and R3 lot could be. So we around 170 feet wide for each one. So we could have back lots and have a 350 foot wide street segment.
okay.
So that was the intent of it. Yeah, the reason for reducing the length is just promote more walkability, make it easier.
And Jackie, the research suggests that that also improves connectivity within neighborhoods, right?
Yes, exactly. So not only will it help people who are walking be more connected with their neighborhood, it also help reduce vehicle miles traveled and the environmental impacts that has by having more ability to get around your neighborhood.
Okay.
Any other thoughts on whether you support the proposed reductions in block length?
Yeah, I support that. Given that it's going to reduce the vehicle miles traveled, of course, and that has implications for air quality improvements also for those neighborhoods. And so, it's a win-win, for people living in those neighborhoods as well. So.
I mean, I don't know how many more major subdivisions we're going to be getting.
Yeah.
Kind of view.
Yeah.
But,
But if we get them, this is
We
what
get
we'll
them.
be doing.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, great. There aren't any other thoughts, we can move on. Okay.
Yeah.
So the next we wanted to go over the required street cross-section elements with you all. So this section defines what each of these cross-section elements are, and then ends with this table that identifies, based off of the type of street, which of the elements would be required. That's identified with the diamond shape. The X means that it is something that's required only if it's identified in an adopted plan. And then the X with a circle around it means it's optional. It's up to the decision of the developer whether or not they would like to include that feature in the roadway type. So this is differentiated, of course, based off of the type of street and then the right-of-way widths that are associated with that. So on all types of streets, you would be required to have, of course, drive aisles and curbs and gutters, appropriate street and traffic signs. Sidewalks, this would be a requirement on both sides of the street. A landscape strip, which is the area between the sidewalk and the right-of-way. And then street trees, which would be planted in the landscape strip itself. Any thoughts on the required street cross-section elements before we move on?
I did have the city engineer review this and review it.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, bicycle facilities would be on the bike lane street.
Yeah. And I see a lot of green elements in there as well.
Yeah.
So, in the future, if the city were to consider complete and green streets, this will very much fit that narrative as well. So, yeah, that's what we want to see.
I like the appearance of street trees. You know this best, but I hear people say that they damage the sidewalks, and then when you fix the sidewalks, you damage the tree. So is that, like, what is that? What would a requirement like this look like in 25 years?
Yeah.
Sure,
So-
that's a great point. So the landscape strip would be have a minimum width that would ensure sufficient soil volume to support the types of street trees that would be allowed to be planted in those areas. So typically when you have issues between the street trees and the sidewalk is when the landscape strip is too narrow. It doesn't have enough soil volume for the tree. So its roots, of course, extend out to underneath the sidewalk. And or you have a tree species that is not an appropriate species for this area. It's going to get too tall. Its canopy is going to be too wide, the diameter of the canopy. And as we all know, the diameter of the canopy is the same diameter as the roots of the tree. So if we have something that has, a really abundant canopy, it's going to have very abundant roots. So it's really a matter of managing the type of trees that are being planted and ensuring that there is sufficient soil volume to support those trees in the landscape strip.
And additionally, I would add that so that the trees play a pivotal role when it comes to prolonging the lifespan of their sidewalk.
Oh,
Right. But then if you choose the wrong tree,
Mhm.
then that is going to compromise the structural integrity of the sidewalk. And that defeats the whole purpose of having trees there, for sustainability purposes, right? So if you choose the right tree with the right root system, then you're going to make sure you reduce, the heating, expansion, cooling, all that, and then how, weatherization and all of that, how it affects the longevity of the sidewalk. So, it boils down to choosing the right trees for the right spaces, and then also, as we get to design all of this, with trees in mind, we're going to make sure that we have at least enough space where trees can go. But if you have even, all the space and you don't choose the right tree, that still, boils down to nothing at all achieved.
And so you would just ensure that in the code, a developer that's required to put these trees in would use the right species for that. Okay.
Yeah, which will be reviewed by our city arborist to ensure it's
Yeah, exactly.
Appreciate the explanation.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so next we're going to move on to roadway stubs. So this is proposed to replace your current standards for temporary cul-de-sacs. So you currently have standards for temporary cul-de-sacs that are really, these street stubs that will in the future connect to undeveloped property or existing roadways. So we just clarified those standards really to differentiate them from a true cul-de-sac, which is meant to be a permanent dead end. So roadway stubs would be required to connect new roads with the future likely connection of roads, like shown in this diagram here. It would be required to, if you're the new developer, you'd be required to design your subdivision to connect to those roadway stubs. As it's a stub, before it gets that future connection, it would need to have a temporary turnaround that would meet Ohio Fire Code to make sure that any property along the stub has adequate fire protection. And then we are including an administrative adjustment if there's just really no viable location to stub a road to an adjacent property. So let's say on this undeveloped property, there's a big wetland that really, the city wants to protect. It doesn't make any sense to plan a future road to go through that natural resource. So that requirement for a stub to connect to adjacent property would no longer, apply to that subject property. Any questions on roadway stubs before we move on?
Minor point, the Ohio Fire Code does not address fire truck turnarounds, only things inside of buildings. So you probably want to change that to city engineer or a local fire department.
Perfect, we can get that adjusted. Thank you for that clarification. Okay. So moving on to conservation design. So this would be a new subdivision type, would most likely be a major subdivision type that would allow for the clustering of residential dwellings in exchange for the preservation of at least 30% of the development site as a permanent conservation area. So permanent would mean placed in a conservation easement dedicated to the city or somehow other, legally kept from future development. So the conservation area would include sensitive natural lands, ravines, wooded areas, wetlands, existing natural resources on a piece of property. Or if a developer is interested in creating a sensitive natural resource, like an area of native plantings or some other, maybe a built wetland, then that would count towards this as well. So we are proposing to allow this in the R1, the R2, and the R3 districts as an option. It's certainly not a requirement. It's just another tool in Stow's toolbox. This would be incentivized by allowing more housing types than might otherwise be allowed in the base zoning districts, mainly to allow for that clustering and accommodate the conservation area. So there wouldn't be any lot area or width requirements applicable in the conservation design, but you would have minimum setbacks just to make sure that homes are adequately separated from one another. And it would also allow for a maximum density increase. So the current standards for the R1 is a maximum of 2 dwelling units per acre. In R2, it's 3 dwelling units per acre. And R3, it's 10 dwelling units per acre. And you can see in the table below how we're proposing to allow for an increase in maximum density to, again, further incentivize the use of this subdivision type to really promote the conservation of Stow's natural resources as kind of the remaining pockets of the city are built out. So we would like your feedback on whether you support conservation design and the expanded allowed housing types and increased density that we're proposing in exchange for the permanent conservation of sensitive natural lands.
And this kind of replaces our cluster development. Same concept, allow for smaller lots, but requiring more open space. So
Is
Just
the, is
the-
the 30% comparable with what's there today?
yeah, I have to double check.
You don't have to do it now. That seemed like a lot, but
Yeah,
I didn't know. Be impressed if you can come up with that quickly.
almost there. Almost there. I'll let you know at the end.
Okay. Depending on that response, if it's a lesser amount of open space that's required, we could consider taking a stepped approach. So let's say you want to set aside 15% of the land area as permanent conservation area. Perhaps you can still benefit from the no lot area or width requirement, so really allowing that clustering, but you don't have access to the expanded allowed housing types or the increase in allowed density. So really trying to think about how we incentivize more conservation area being preserved versus not. It could be one approach to kind of expanding this conservation design and creating more opportunities for its use. Any other thoughts?
I think this is excellent. And I know that we don't have a lot of land space to do some of these, things there. But once you make a bold statement like this with a conservation design, it tends to spur action for, other parts of the city which predate this whole design and all of that in the new areas. So I think it's a bold statement and very much welcoming.
Great. Okay. We'll move on then. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just checking if there's anything else. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, just wanted to check if there were any other comments or questions on the subdivision chapter before we move into access and mobility.
We're good.
All right, sounds like we can go ahead. So chapter 9 is our access and mobility chapter. This is really handling all of the components that contribute to someone's ability to access and circulate on a private property. So we're looking at improving the transportation system, making sure we have a more multimodal, interconnected network. We want to make sure we're minimizing negative impacts on the environment, prioritizing a more human-scaled built environment that accommodates pedestrians, but also relieves traffic congestion and provides adequate but not excessive off-street parking. So this chapter does have quite a bit of new standards that we wanted to review with you all. The right-of-way improvements, so what the developer would be required to improve within the public right-of-way as a part of new development or redevelopment. We aren't proposing any changes to those current standards, so we weren't going to go into detail on those today. But before we get into the proposed standards themselves, wanted to go over this applicability table with you all. So this is at the beginning of chapter 9, and it identifies as a part of new development, major redevelopment, intermediate redevelopment, minor redevelopment, and change of use. And of course, those are all defined terms. How you would need to comply with these standards. So for example, if you are doing a new development or a major redevelopment or intermediate redevelopment, you would need to make sure that your driveways comply with the new standards, that your minimum parking spaces comply with the new standards. However, if you are intermediate redevelopment, then you only would need to make sure that the part of the site that is being impacted by that redevelopment activity meets the minimum parking setback standards or the permitted parking area location. So it's really trying to ensure that the amount of compliance with the new standards is aligned with the amount of reinvestment or new investment that's happening on a property. And so certainly we'd ask that you all take a closer look at this list, especially after we go through each of the sections and provide us with your feedback on when you think it should be required or for the entire site to come into compliance with certain standards, when only the impacted portion of a site should come into these standards, or whether it shouldn't be required as a part of a certain level of redevelopment for compliance to be met. So certainly, if you have any immediate feedback, we'd love to hear that. If you want to kind of digest the table a bit more, think through things in more detail, certainly provide any feedback you have to Zach, and he'll pass that along to us. So the first area of change that we wanted to go over with you all is for driveways. So first, if you have a corner lot and a through lot or a through lot that is on a, let's say, a major arterial and a collector road, the new standards would require the driveway to take access off of the collector road rather than the major arterial to improve traffic flow along the major arterial street and kind of drive that turning activity to the lower classification street that is slower speed and kind of better accommodated or better designed to accommodate that type of turning movement. We're also proposing a minimum separation between driveways on adjacent properties, and this would be based off of the fronting roadway type. So if you are on a higher classification roadway where you have more drive lanes, the speeds are higher, those driveways have to be farther apart from one another to ensure that we're not creating traffic circulation issues or safety issues from too much turning movement on those roadways. We're also proposing a maximum driveway width of 30 feet or 30% of lot width. But there is an administrative adjustment that we're proposing. If the width is really necessary for larger trucks, if the volume of traffic really warrants it, or if there's some other reason that's directly related to traffic control and safety that the applicant can provide to the planning director, then the planning director is able to approve a wider width of a driveway. Any questions here before we move on? Sounds good. So next, we are proposing some new standards for internal access drives. And I think the best way to think about internal access drives is I think we've all driven in, a Walmart parking lot or a, big grocery store parking lot where it feels like you're just sort of lost in the parking lot. You don't really know where you're supposed to be driving versus, going to park, etc. And it can feel like an unsafe situation, especially if you're, pushing your grocery cart or your stroller with your baby. So these internal access drive standards are really meant to help provide a more clear location where you're supposed to be driving to access the site versus driving to access parking on the site. So this would be required, we are proposing for developments that include more than 200 parking spaces. So that's a pretty significant size of development. So certainly wouldn't apply to, smaller shopping centers or smaller commercial uses, just pretty significantly sized ones. And then we'd have two types of internal access drives. The first is the primary internal drive, and you can see from the diagram here that would be the roadway, essentially, that would connect the development site to the street. And then the secondary internal drive would connect the primary internal drive to the parking lot itself. So we wanted to get your feedback on whether you support the proposed internal access drive standards to help improve circulation and connectivity within these large developments.
Thoughts? Good to move on.
It sounds like most standard larger shopping centers and stuff I've been to recently. I mean, that sounds nice. Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, it's just to ensure there's proper access and circulation around the property. Again, it's only for those larger ones, 5 acres more spaces. Okay.
Great. Move on then to our next topic, which is trails. The city has a connectivity plan that it has recently adopted and identifies where existing trail connections are proposed or where planned trails are proposed to be established. So we are proposing that if one of those trails traverses a development site, then the developer would either provide a 30-foot public trail easement and then construct the trail in accordance with the connectivity plan, or provide a payment in lieu of the construction and provide a 50-foot easement for the city to build that trail in the future. So you can see on the map here, this is pulled directly from that connectivity plan. The dashed lines would be those planned trail connections or new planned trails to help fill out the city's trail network. So if your site or a portion of your site goes through one of these planned trail connections, that is when this requirement would be triggered. So this is a new standard, a new requirement that we are proposing. So we definitely want to get your thoughts on whether you think this is appropriate to be required as a part of new development and major redevelopment.
I don't have a problem with these. I just thought 30 feet and 50 feet seemed very large. I mean, even our major trails that exist currently in the city are probably, what, 8 feet wide, maybe?
Special pavement.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
that's the pavement side. Maybe
Well, I understand that, but I mean, I've built roads in 50-foot easements and they're a lot wider than 8 feet.
Jackie, is the 30 feet pretty standard for a public trail easement?
We see it as pretty standard. So the 30-foot would allow for, maintenance of the sides of the trails. And the 50-foot would just make sure that the city has the space necessary to actually build out the trail itself. Certainly, if the city thinks that number could be reduced, I would certainly want to contact, Parks and Rec and the engineering staff to make sure that we're getting enough land area that's appropriate to make sure that they're able to build out the trail system that they're looking for. But I think that's great feedback that perhaps that's a bit wide, and we can contact engineering and Parks and Rec to make sure that we're really right sizing that number and not asking for more land be in an easement than is truly necessary.
Yeah, I'll follow up with engineering and parks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of the trails. I just
Yeah.
think those are, I mean, if you think of some of these areas where 50 feet might not be a big deal, but then when you look into, get into some of these closer in city streets, smaller lots, 30 feet's huge. I mean, for a 6 to 8 foot trail.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we could work it out. We could add some language maybe that, or as determined by
Right.
city engineer.
Right, I mean, and there's gonna be, right, if there's a cross slope or there's, there's some geographical feature that
Yeah.
would require a bigger easement, then, right, an adjustment to that is probably a good way to approach, what that ends up being.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, having the city engineer, whoever, be able to approve an adjustment if they find that a lesser easement would be necessary. Great. Okay. So moving on then to pedestrian walkways. So this is a proposed requirement for development sites that would connect the building to the right-of-way, buildings to one another, parking areas to building entrances and internal access drives, building entrances to transit stops if there are any on the site, and then again to the public sidewalks. So really just making sure that sites are safe and accessible for pedestrians and not just vehicles. But recognizing that certain sites may have a topography or natural resources that prevent compliance with these requirements, we are proposing that an administrative adjustment be available for those circumstances. Any thoughts on these requirements? Okay. So next we want to go over vehicle parking. So we are proposing to adjust your minimum requirements for parking first so that they are primarily based off of square footage and not off of variable factors like employees or capacity of a building that can change over time, where the amount of parking is a much more static number. So really looking to focus on square footage so that it's easier to calculate what the requirement would be. We are also proposing to right-size the minimum requirements, so lowering them in most instances. So you can see in the table here on the screen, the proposed changes to a few of the uses. So multifamily currently requires 2.5 parking spaces per dwelling unit. We're proposing to reduce that to 1.5 spaces per dwelling unit. We're seeing that as a much more industry standard amount of parking to be provided. Of course, the developer could provide more parking if they think that's necessary, but they would not be required to. Similarly, for restaurants, going from 1 per 50 square feet to 1 per 250 square feet. And then major manufacturing, other types of industrial uses, going from 1 per 400 square feet to 1 per 1,000 square feet. And then in addition to lowering the minimum requirements, we are also proposing that an administrative adjustment be allowed for required parking if, let's say, there's a great big tree that the developer wants to preserve that would be, in an area that they otherwise would need to build as parking to meet their minimum standards. That could be a factor that's considered for a parking adjustment. Same with proximity to transit. If you're sharing a parking lot with another use that has different hours of operation, if you have on-street parking that's available, if you have efficiency units, and that would be a defined term in the building code, so it'd be really under a certain size. So really small units where you're not going to have more than one person living in it. Affordable units, since lower income households own cars at a lower rate. And then if you're able to provide a parking study that shows you just don't need the amount of parking that is being required. So we wanted to get your thoughts on whether these administrative adjustments seem reasonable, or if there are other circumstances that you think would qualify for an administrative adjustment.
I like the move from, number of employees to square footage based. But I'm wondering if that's as accurate a way to do it for some of the places of assembly, like, meeting places, places of worship. What else did I pick out here?
What about like an office, just plain office?
Well, I mean, offices are,
Could be variable too.
don't, yeah, that they generally don't vary that much. But I mean, like the Stow Youth baseball place over here, right? I mean, 1 per 500 seats for 500 square feet means there's probably like 50 people in that building. And I'm sure there's more than 50 people in there in any major get together. I know I've been in there with more than 50 people. So it just, while I applaud the square footage calculation, I'm wondering if some of these might not be more applicable to number of seats. However, given the administrative adjustments and or the parking study, I think that covers both of them. So maybe I just spoke out of turn. Sorry. I answered my own question.
Well, and these are just minimums, right? So I think a lot of times like a larger sports complex does know that they're going to have much more parking demand, that their business model isn't going to work out unless they have sufficient parking. So they certainly can provide more parking if they think it's necessary. This is just trying to make sure that the city isn't requiring more parking than a business actually thinks is necessary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, good point. I missed that. I guess I got sidetracked when I saw no parking spaces required for cemeteries.
I was nervous about the residential portions of it. It seems like there was a potential administrative adjustment for a maximum of 1 required space credited for a single family dwelling or a duplex. And whenever I drive around town a lot, and it seems like there's more and more people parking in the roadway, and it creates issues when it snows. It creates issues for the plows. It creates issues for emergency vehicles, school buses, and I don't know. I almost feel like we need to, in the case of single family and maybe duplex dwellings, we actually need more parking. I mean, we have 4 drivers in my house and 2 drivers and 4 cars. My next door neighbor has 4 drivers, 5 cars, 3 motorcycles. And these are like 1/3 acre lots. It's not like we're rural or anything. And so I'd hate to encourage on-street parking in new single family residential developments. I feel like it's already kind of tight.
Yeah. That's a fair point. Jackie, have you seen anything greater than 2 units or 2 parking spaces for single family or duplexes? Or is 2 pretty standard?
2 is pretty standard, but we could exempt or not allow single family homes or duplexes to be eligible for some of these administrative adjustments. So they couldn't get lower than the 2 parking spaces approved. It could be just for on-street parking, and some of those other ones, or it could just be any use other than a single family or duplex is eligible for an administrative adjustment.
Yeah, I think that could work. At least, requiring at least 2 per unit for this.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. All right. Moving on, then we'll get into bicycle parking. So these bicycle parking requirements are proposed to apply to new multifamily, mixed use, and non-residential development. So it wouldn't apply to single family, duplex, townhomes, etc. So what's being proposed is 1 bicycle parking space be required for every 20 off-street parking spaces, up to a maximum of 10 total. So in really large parking lots, you wouldn't have, you know, a sea of bicycle parking. It would be up to 10 total. The requirement would be to have the bicycle parking on the same lot as the use. We need to be in an area that's adequately lit and visible from the street, and within 50 feet of a building entrance. This is all to ensure usability and safety for the bicycle parking spaces. And then we've also included some minimum design criteria, dimensional standards, which are very typical, very standard for kind of off the shelf bike racks that you could purchase. So just making sure there's adequate space for people to actually access the bicycle parking and then park their bicycles as well. So we wanted to get your feedback on the proposed bicycle parking requirements. Do you support introducing these new standards?
Any thoughts?
Okay.
I'm a bicycle rider, so I'm inclined towards bicycle parking. I don't see them getting used a lot, but that's not that it means I'm gonna discourage them.
Right.
So,
And it's not like it's a lot, it's 1 rack. for
yeah, I
20
mean,
spaces,
in the grand scheme of things, you know, and I would have probably made the argument for Mike, since he's not here, that, you know, it's not applicable in industrial district because you don't want people riding bikes through an industrial area. But I mean, you're building a 200,000 square foot building, putting in a couple bike racks is,
You have trails on the floor
Late.
too. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and I used to ride my bike to work, so.
there you go.
Perfect.
Yes.
So next we wanted to go over loading. So we are proposing to provide some more flexibility in the loading space requirements. So there is no minimum number of loading spaces that would need to be provided for specific uses, but if a development is providing loading spaces, then there are standards that they would need to meet. The standards are really focused on ensuring there's sufficient space and access so that the truck movements aren't interfering with parking areas or spilling out onto the street, really trying to contain them to kind of designated areas on a lot. We are also proposing that the loading areas be limited to the interior side or rear of a building, trying to minimize the overall appearance and of the loading areas from those public spaces. But certainly want to get your feedback on this. It could be appropriate to exempt industrial areas from these, from the location restriction. Just have in your commercial areas the requirement to have the loading docks a bit more off to the side, a bit more screened, so that they're not quite as much of an eyesore in your commercial areas where they're much more typical, more expected in your industrial areas.
I don't think industrial areas need to be exempted. There's certainly times when I've done layouts and you can't but want to put the loading dock towards the street. But again, not in, like this noted here, maneuvering space, not where trucks need to back into or back out of the street to get to them. Typically, when they're seen from the street, there's some type of screening requirement added. So I don't think it needs to be exempted, but maybe some screening as opposed to the 100 feet from the residential district is one of the comments in here.
I think we did have a screening requirement in the landscape chapter.
I thought so too, somewhere. So, and then I don't think it was 100 feet. I think it was less than 100 feet. But, but that might just be something to cross-reference and see what it looks like.
Yeah, certainly. So I think what I'm hearing is in industrial areas, if to allow the loading to be located on the front, towards the front of the building, between the building and the right of way, if adequate screening is provided, so it's not an eyesore from the street.
Yes.
Sounds good. Any other thoughts on the access and mobility chapter before we move on?
Yes, for the industrial zones, I'm just wondering if we want to create some exception for maybe the particular business, operational needs for some of those, industrial buildings. Because maybe a particular property owner, based on how their business works and how, what they do, are we going to have some form of, exception for them based on how they operate?
I didn't see anything in here that would require anything like that. I thought this was written enough that it would allow it. Is a good example, a building like the ones being built up off of Seasons Road. A lot of those sometimes have cross docks, means there's docks on both sides. Well, the only way to do that without having them in the front yard would be to orient it with the docks on the side yards, or sometimes the lot is wide and not deep, so you'd have to orient the building this way, so you would have docks in the front. That's where the screening would come into play from the road. So I think these are written from an industrial perspective, fine. And I will tell you that no matter how much room you give truck drivers, they will always take more. I love truck drivers. For somebody that drives vehicles around like that with us crazy people every day, but they will run over everything they can. And then some.
Great. All right, then we will move on to our next chapter, which is our sign standards. So this is chapter 10. The purpose of the chapter is to enhance the physical appearance of the city, make sure we're creating an attractive economic and business climate. I want to make sure that we're reducing any sign distractions that can cause traffic accidents, eliminate hazards, make sure we're relieving pedestrian and traffic connection, and then avoiding the canceling out effect that kind of sign clutter can have on the community. So similar for the other chapters, we have our applicability table here. So this is, again, identifying as part of different levels of redevelopment, new development, or change of use, when you would need to come into compliance with these various standards. So a lot of the standards that would require you to replace the sign would really only come into would only be applicable for new development and major redevelopment and the impacted part of a intermediate redevelopment site. Some of the standards that are across the board that would always need to be complied with, things like illumination, signs should, you should be able to change the illumination of a sign to comply with the new standards. Electronic message boards are able to be brought into compliance, existing electronic message boards into compliance with any new standards. Temporary signs, of course, they're temporary, so those should always be in compliance with the code. And then the prohibited signs and content and safety, maintenance, removal, and abandonment, always requiring compliance in those instances. So the kind of main part of the chapter here is this permitted and allowed sign types by land uses. So we have our land uses in our columns and our sign types in our rows. A filled-in circle means that that sign would require a sign permit before being established. A just circle outline would mean that you are not required to receive a sign permit before getting to erect your sign. We did want to get your input on whether the sign types, sizes, heights, etc., should be regulated by land use or differentiated by district. This would be especially pertinent in your commercial districts. So the thought process behind having them regulated by district rather than by land use is so that the types of signs, the size of signs that are allowed in your more pedestrian-oriented commercial districts are more pedestrian-oriented, right? So they're a bit smaller. They are perhaps more building attached or wall signs rather than standalone monument signs. And then in your higher intensity commercial districts, where you are along a highway or you're along another type of major road, you would be allowed a larger sign, a taller sign to better attract or better communicate with the drivers along those roadway types. So I wanted to get your feedback. The city currently regulates signs by land use. We as consultants typically recommend that they be regulated or differentiated by district. So we wanted to get your thoughts before we made any big changes to your sign allowances in Stow.
15% on a wall sign for an industrial use is huge. I just did a quick, a 300-foot long building, which is probably what the one facing Route 8 is up there at 40 feet high, means you could have an 1,800 square foot sign. I mean, 1,800 feet is about the size of the side of this building.
Yeah.
So,
Do you think that should be
One side
lowered?
Yeah, I think it should be.
I feel like 7.5%. I did the calculation, like, because I was thinking about like a typical like tenant in a multi-tenant building, like a 20 by 20.
The building on the west side of Route 8 put up a sign recently. It begins with an R, I think. You have any idea how big that sign is?
On the west side of it,
Yeah, faces a highway, south end of the building.
not Haydon, right?
Haydon, they can
Haydon,
say
yeah.
H. That's what I said, an R, H. R looks like an H.
Yeah.
I don't know what size it is. I have to double check, but it's not 1,800.
So, no,
Yeah.
it might be 200 or 300 at max.
Right now it is 7.5%. For industrial buildings, like what is it? Is there like 400 feet? No. That's for commercial, but I don't know if that, I think for industrial, it's just 7.5%.
Okay, well, I mean,
Yeah.
obviously not something we need to decide now, but 15 seems big. Very big.
Yeah, we can definitely revisit those percents.
Same for
So
like,
now,
sorry, I was gonna say, like 7.5%, like on a typical like 20 by 20 tenant space, they'd be allowed approximately 7.5%, 5%. Like on a typical 20 by 20 at 7.5%, they'd be still allowed, at least what our code allows today based on that size. Which is, we determine it based on the length of the tenant space. It's 1.5 times the length. But I think 7.5, based on the wall area, makes sense as well.
We do have a cap though, so we could have a cap 30% too,
We could, yeah.
but a maximum size.
yeah, we typically see anywhere between 5 and 10% wall area for the max sign for a wall sign, just to make sure that you are able to have a sign that's proportional to the building. But yeah, I think we could certainly look at a total maximum, bringing it down to like that 7.5% that Zach is saying is pretty typical for what you all have today. If we think that's appropriate.
Briefly, Jackie, the illumination part. So lighting, color, temperature of lights. I know, again, we're talking today about 3,000 Kelvin, versus 4,000 Kelvin, and how the associated pollution that comes with the lights, the glare, the impacts on physical activities and humans and all of that, with sleep patterns and general health implications and all that. Are we looking at that, with the with some standards or requirements around that?
Yeah, so in the general development standards that we presented to you all at the last meeting, there were some outdoor lighting standards that were being proposed as a part of that. So that would be for a site in general, to regulate all of the outdoor lighting on the site. And then we do have, as a part of this chapter, some more specific standards for signs themselves. One of the differentiations that we make is external illumination versus internal illumination, and then different standards for those two, just to make sure signs are lit so that people are able to read them, but also that they're not so bright that they become a nuisance.
Did we include any specifics, with regarding the color temperature, either 3,000, 4,000, all of that? I know I was talking to Zach earlier today about a project happening in Cleveland Heights where First Energy is replacing the current street light bulbs with LED light bulbs, and we are requiring that they replace the current bulbs with 3,000 K bulbs. What is happening now is that when the lights go out, First Energy goes in and throws in a 4,000 K LED bulb. What that means is that you will find, when you're driving, you'll find one very bright versus another one. There's, and it has several
Right.
implications. Vision.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, so
So,
certainly in the outdoor lighting standards in I believe it's chapter 5, correct me if I'm wrong, Zach, chapter 6, excuse me, in chapter 6. We do have maximum color temperature, color rendering standards to make sure that we're not allowing lights that are too blue, like you said, that contribute to that light pollution, disrupt people's sleep patterns, and really just don't increase the visibility on a site, right? They can actually work against what lighting is supposed to do. So there was some discussion during that meeting. We had proposed a maximum of 2,700 Kelvin, and there was some discussion on allowing for an administrative adjustment up to a higher standard. I think it was around 4,000. Someone had recommended if there was some, security purposes or some other standard that the applicant could provide to justify wanting a higher color temperature for their lighting.
sounds good.
I think that works externally lit signs,
Yes.
but internally lit signs,
Absolutely.
Subway has their yellow, right? They want their sign to be yellow, so it's gotta work for them.
Yeah, internally that should be fine, but when it's impacting other people, then.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So now I'm just going to flip through really quickly all the different sign types that we're proposing. There are some that you have in your code today and some that are a bit different. So awning canopy signs, those are pretty straightforward. Drive-through signs would be specifically like the menu board signage, other types of accessory signage that you would see for a drive-through. A projecting sign you often see in more walkable, pedestrian-oriented areas that are smaller and project out from the facade of a building. Wall signs, as we had discussed, very typical, very common. We do have some more information on wall sign standards. I think we discussed this already with the group, but certainly can get into it again with the maximum wall sign area. Yeah, so certainly if we want to reduce that down more to the 7.5% that we see in the community today across the board, we're happy to do that. We are proposing some additional wall sign area be able to be approved if the higher quality wall sign is utilized, so individually affixed letters. If we lower the standard down to 7.5% across the board, do you all support allowing for some of that additional sign area to incentivize higher quality signage be installed?
It's awesome that your sign examples got the raceways because they kind of cheated there. That's looks
Right,
like it's
yes.
the letters, but that's actually just one sign. That's Google.
Yeah, only in this case, right?
Jack, real quick to clarify, cabinet signs would be prohibited, right?
Yes, so moving forward, new cabinet signs would not be allowed. So raceway signs would be allowed, other types of affixed signage. But then it would be the individually affixed letters that have that would qualify for additional sign area. So that's really going to be a much higher end product, typically more expensive. So in exchange for the higher quality sign, you'd be getting a little bit more sign area.
I mean, the cabinet signs, that'd just be for wall cabinets, obviously not for ground cabinets, but yeah, it's an aesthetic requirement. That's what the whole sign code is. So for the way I look at this code, we only have a limited amount of commercial property left. You know, we want to make sure that's good quality development and quality signage. So
If you're happy, Zach, I'm fine.
I like the idea of prohibiting cabinets. Then we can get some upgraded signage around here, but thoughts on that?
Signs too.
Please.
Moving on then, the next sign type is a window sign, a permanent window sign. So that's when we're looking at this applied vinyl type of window signage. Next, we have single tenant monument signs. Wanted to go over some of the proposed standards here. Maximum area for residential uses would be 25 square feet. Uses in the mixed use overlay or public institutional and commercial uses would be at 50 feet. And then industrial and automotive uses would be at 75 square feet, whereas the maximum sign height would remain at 8 feet. We just want to note that we are proposing a slight increase in the maximum area for industrial and automotive uses from 50 square feet to 75 square feet. So they're able to have a bit larger of a monument sign.
That also larger sign apply for businesses that have like a farther setback, maybe? I don't know, I'm just worried about like,
We could build that now.
yeah, I'm just worried about businesses that you can't really see like from the road. If you can't see their store frontage, they might need a little bit additional signage space to attract their clientele.
Certainly, we could so we could build that in, and we could also include like a sign easement standard. So even though it's not your property necessarily, you could have a sign that's located closer to the street to advertise your business that may be set back a bit further.
Well, okay, because I had circled under prohibited signs, the first one, which is off premises sign, which is prescribed. And I would say that there are times when, you gave a good example, when an off premises sign is highly desired for a owner. Had to be able to do that with a sign easement, I would be all in favor of, but you might have to adjust the
Yeah.
prohibited signs, off premises sign.
Yeah, I agree. I like that. It's also, I like Gene, if you coming up with Chick-fil-A signs being off premise. I was like the Chick-fil-A and Sheets that's going in on Kent. It's all like one development, but they're separate properties.
They're set so far back.
The gas stations,
So,
the evil gas stations, are they gonna have a car wash?
Yeah,
Jackie,
I
we
think
can
we
build it.
can certainly build in some standards for sign easements. I think the idea is to prevent billboards, but certainly not to prevent off-premises like signage to direct people to a business that's, you know, just kind of set back further from the road or part of a larger development site. So yeah, we can certainly build that in to allow for that, and then clarify in the prohibited signs list that, you know, unless approved with a sign easement. Okay. We are proposing some new standards for electronic message boards. So these would be allowed as a part of single tenant and multi-tenant monument signs. We're proposing to restrict them to 50% of the allowed sign area. Currently, you have a maximum of 33% of the allowed sign area, but Zach let us know that this is a frequent variance request. So we wanted to adjust the code to allow for a bit larger of a sign to minimize those variance requests moving forward. And then we do have some standards, new standards for the message or the image that's being displayed on the electronic message board. And these are really to ensure that they don't become distracting, especially for drivers. So you need to have a static message or image. It would need to transition instantly, so it couldn't dissolve or scroll or do any type of other movement. And then you wouldn't be able to change it more than once every 10 seconds. So we wanted to get your thoughts on the standards in general, but also if you support the proposed increase in area to reduce the number of variance requests that the city receives.
This also does a couple other things. It takes away the requirement that the electronic area has to be surrounded by 12 inches of masonry, which is proven difficult for people, and we get variances for that a lot. So to take away that requirement, yeah, and Jeff Wagner emailed me before, and he said that he'd be in support of even 75% of allowed sound area.
Wow.
Which I think is a lot. I think these can be distracting if they get too big, you know.
They get really expensive quick.
They get very expensive.
I don't know if people are gonna take advantage of that. Of course, you know, 10 years from now, they might be much cheaper, but.
Right.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on the allowable size of it?
If it reduces variances, then, yeah.
So it would take away the masonry thing.
In the city.
You don't have people complying with it.
Did the city have an issue trying to put one out from it?
Yeah, which we'll discuss in the next planning action.
Yeah.
It's like before, or after they park the school bus out there.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, ideally,
That's a violation.
yeah, honestly, ideally, we'll talk about at the end of this, we're doing a master sign plan also with this code. So like city property would be good for something like that. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah. So everyone go with 50%? Seems more appropriate.
All right. So next we wanted to go over multi-tenant monument signs and some of the standards we're proposing there. So for commercial uses, that's staying at the 50 square feet. Same with the industrial and automotive uses at 75 square feet. So that standard would be the same for single tenant and multi-tenant. But then for public and institutional, we are proposing to allow for up to 75 square feet. So that would be a increase in the maximum area for both the public, institutional, and industrial and automotive uses. But we would be maintaining the sign height at 8 feet. So there was one new proposed standard that we wanted to get your thoughts on. So staff had recommended that we limit the total number of like tenant slots on a multi-tenant sign to a maximum of 4 to ensure that they are legible, so that we're, when you're driving down the road, you're not trying to, read off of these tiny signs there on the Woodway collection sign to see if you're, going to miss your turn or not. But we wanted to get your thoughts on whether 4 is the right number. Should it maybe be based off of something else to still, ensure that we're controlling legibility and preventing traffic and safety concerns, but not being too onerous or too perhaps arbitrary in the standard.
This is my idea.
That's a tough one.
That is a-
Because if you think of like where Giant Eagle is, there's a sign out there, and I'm sure it's got more than more. Because you got major retailers back there, right?
They can keep replacing those sign faces, existing non-conforming.
Right, but I know, yeah, but for, will we get another development of that scale? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean,
4 might be.
I wanted to include some examples of these signs like in the city, but I didn't want to offend anybody. Like the panels get so small that you cannot read them. They don't serve a purpose. If you try to read them, it can be a hazard for driving.
Is there a way to make the requirement that you get your sign out on the the multi-tenant sign out front if you've got over 10,000 square feet or something, or 20,000 square feet, so you don't end up with Ella Eyes who owns a mini little strip somewhere in the back and, you know, is clogging up the sign out front.
I've seen other situations where it is like a small plaza with maybe 5 tenants. And, you know, they might, like, they're pretty common in Columbus. They'll have like maybe a 6 foot or 5 foot tall sign, has the name on top, and then 4 tenant panels are below it, which works well. They're, you know, they all match in size, it's consistent.
Of course, an electronic sign here would solve this problem.
Just
I
flash.
was just about to say that a lot of
Right.
the newer signs that we're seeing,
It's
you
like a
have
delay.
the major tenants, you know, taking up some of the permanent tenant sign spaces, and then your smaller tenants kind of in a scrolling electronic message board. So their name gets up, you know, once every 30 seconds, once every 60 seconds, but it's not there permanently. Those permanent spaces are reserved for the much larger anchor tenants.
Something.
I also recommended yeah, so that if they use tenant panels and changeable copy, including electronic copy, then no more than 50% of the total, that portion of it shall occupy no more than 50% of the sign area. So the idea would be to have like the plaza name, at least 50% of it, if they're using tenant panels and changeable copy, whether it's a manual copy or electronic version.
And these can be how big? 75 square feet?
And what was the
75
Jackie?
square feet in for industrial and automotive, public and institutional, and then up to 50 square feet for commercial.
I think there's room to even increase it in the commercial for multi-tenants. So I don't know what you guys think.
I like what you're thinking. I think 4 might be too limiting, but yeah, I would like to avoid that clutter also some way. So,
It was a lot easier to read this one than that one, so.
yeah.
And I don't want to do it based on like a maximum tenant panel size either. I think that'd be hard to accommodate every type of sign.
We defer to your wisdom.
Yeah.
Like, wanted to stay out of signs.
Just from the older plazas. I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah, I was literally just today, I was driving down Kent Road, I think, and I saw a sign like the one on the right, and I thought, it's time to read all that. That GPS, it takes you right to the front door anyway.
That's a good point.
I know signs aren't used
Well,
the way they were.
If the business is closed too, they stay up there and you don't know.
Yeah, you don't know if it's still in business.
Yeah.
So everyone agrees. First signs.
Perhaps not 4, close to 4, right?
Well, if 4 is what the code gets rewritten to and you start seeing a lot of variances, then, you know, you'll maybe want to change it to 6 or something in the future.
Yeah.
Just go through a text amendment process.
Yeah.
For sure.
Would everyone be more comfortable with doing a little more, 5 or 6?
I would do probably 6.
Yeah, it does say 6.
6 is fine, yeah.
Awesome. We can get that adjusted. Okay. Next sign type are post signs. We see this as particularly applicable in public and institutional type land uses, where you might have a more historic building with this type of signage. On-site traffic directional signs. These are the signs that are, you know, exit only, entrance only, drive through this way, the types of signs that help direct traffic internally to a site through the parking area. And then we get into our temporary signs, We did have to adjust the types of signage that you have for temporary signs to eliminate any content-specific standards based off of a Supreme Court decision that came down back in 2015. So all of the sign names are based off of the type of signage. So we no longer have like real estate signs or election campaign signs, but you can see how we're trying to capture those signs with these more general or generic names. And then it's just up to the property owner, up to the tenant, what they want to display on that signage at what time. So mounted banner signs, light pole banner signs within parking lots, not on public streets, temporary window signs, ground mounted banner signs, post and panel signs, which you most typically see for non-residential real estate, A-frame and sandwich board signs, which you would see mostly in more pedestrian-oriented commercial areas, post signs, which are very typical for residential real estate, and then yard signs, which captures a wide array of temporary signage. So, your booster signs for your kids' sports team, campaign election signs, real estate signage, sort of an all-inclusive type of sign category. Any questions or comments on the types of signs that are being proposed to be allowed, or for which land uses they're being proposed to be allowed for? Okay. So lastly, for signs, we wanted to go over the master sign plan. So this is a new process. It's very similar to a planned development, but just for signage on a property. So through this process, you can achieve some additional sign area, but you may be subject to some higher standards for design, placement, size. We are proposing that the planning director be the review and approval body for the master sign plan, and the criteria they would use to decide whether or not the sign plan is appropriate would be the placement, the quantity, and the size, and more detail on kind of what they would be thinking about for those various criteria are included in the code. So we have a couple of discussion questions we want to get your feedback on. So the first one, should a master sign plan be allowed for all development as proposed currently, or should it be limited to non-residential development over a specified square footage, so that it's not, any corner store or strip center that's getting additional square footage, but it's larger developments, maybe. We often see this needed for larger, hospitals or other types of uses that have maybe multiple buildings on their site, or just require some more signage than what might be typical. And then we also want to get your feedback on whether the planning director should be the review and approval person for these master sign plans, or if you think it should go in front of the plan commission or the city council for their weigh-in.
So the way this would work is you have like multi-tenant building. Somebody could propose the master sign plan where we would have like a template that they can fill out, then they would list the types of sign allowed, the square footage, the materials. They could even list out the colors that they require in their plaza, how big the monument sign can be, all that information. And then whenever there's a new sign, we would just defer to the master sign plan instead of the zoning code. We'd keep record of it. You would tie to like our GIS, so we could easily find it and access it, and sign contractors could find it as well. But that's how they would work. It's still have more flexibility where the sign code might not work for every situation. Yeah.
Do you think that is too broad of a scope for you to manage? I mean, I'm not saying that in a bad way.
No, I get it. That's my thought too.
should it be somewhat based upon these standards? Somehow.
Yeah,
So that, I mean, somebody comes in and wants millions of signs and you happen to not like them, you know, I'm not saying that that's likely, but you know, I could see a battle going on here that
Yeah.
puts you in a bad place.
yeah, I can see that too. And one of my thoughts was maybe I could be the reviewer if it meets all the sign code requirements.
Mhm.
If they need variances or something, then I have to get planning commission approval.
Yeah.
Or within a deviation thereof,
Within a certain deviation as
Yeah.
well, yeah.
10% deviation or something.
I don't know if council will go for it, but even only requiring planning commission review.
Yeah.
Also want to reduce the amount of applications that, give planning commission a little bit more decision power rather than just recommending. And this might be a good example of that.
I like the fact that we want to base it on something that is in the document then.
Yeah.
So that at least that gives you some, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Backup.
Right.
I think by streamlining it too, it's gonna eliminate some frustrations from the business owners, like side too, because the signs take so
Yeah.
long to be manufactured, put together, designed.
Yeah.
Then to do this process, and then to have to go to city council, planning commission and city council, it just would speed the process a couple weeks.
Yeah. What do you guys think about requiring it? Like in what situations should we require it? When I worked for Gehanna, they put in a master sign plan as a requirement for any new signs and multi-tenant commercial facilities. So whether it's existing or not, if somebody wanted to put one tenant sign, they had to go through and get a master sign plan done. That's a quick way to see a lot of change.
Yeah.
Might upset a lot of people. If somebody wants to get one sign, they have to put together this plan and potentially go through planning commission. I can see benefits both ways. I got 1 hour. I'm good before my computer restarts.
I just think if you're comfortable with it, that's where I would use that as a basis of putting this together.
Right.
Certainly don't need to make more sign work for anybody. Either the people, you,
Mhm.
you know, the idea is to create something that in the future helps that development get a more streamlined approval process. Tenant moves out, another tenant moves in.
Right.
Okay, meets the sign plan, off you go.
Yeah.
Right.
But then the plaza, or the property owner has more say of what they allow to. They have more teeth to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of a few situations where I highly recommend this, like, where we're doing the amphitheater at that plaza. We'll definitely do a master sign plan. I can see city property, city center, doing a master sign plan. Even parks, this, the sign code's not going to accommodate every situation, especially these large properties. It's difficult to do that. So this gives us that flexibility.
Or John.
Yeah.
It sounds like we want to keep it as an option that a property owner could choose or elect to utilize, but also allow them to just go through the basic standards of the code if they don't want to go through the extra steps of getting a master sign plan approved. And then it did seem like we wanted to have the master sign plan approved by the plan commission. Was I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, if they needed a variance from the sign code.
Yeah, if they wanted larger or more signage, then that would go in from the plan commission.
Maybe a certain deviation, like, I don't know, I think 5% deviation has been typical.
Sure. Yeah, I think that makes sense. So if it's just a 5% deviation from the standard, that could be approved administratively. Anything more than that would be approved by a plan commission.
Jackie, can we add on more evaluation criteria?
Totally. Yeah. Definitely.
Colors, sign material,
Material,
yeah.
For sure. Any final thoughts on the master sign plan or the sign standards in general?
We didn't talk about prohibited signs. We talked a little bit about off-premises signs, and I wanted to just touch on, and I'm not gonna blame a certain sector of our country, but car dealers, are gonna continue to put up things like inflatable signs and Zach's personal favorite, the ones that I call the feather signs. What do you call them?
Like the flag signs.
Yeah, well, yeah, the ones that just, yeah, stick in the ground
Yeah.
and they will kind of, wind blown signs, I guess I would classify that as. And,
Yeah.
you know, I know they're prohibited in a lot of communities and you still see them. And I think you and I asked you that question the one time. I'm like, so every time you see those, they're basically just in violation. And the
Yeah.
answer was yes. And I'm like, well, people are gonna continue to do that. So
True.
either we just continue to have this as a problem and ignore it, or you're gonna end up writing, the letter that says, please remove this non-conforming sign.
Then I'll put up over the weekend.
And then, and quite frankly, with the
Yeah.
Sergeant Clean people, I said, look, they're prohibited. Everybody does it. Go stick one up and they'll come and they'll write you a letter. Then you ignore the first letter. And when the second letter shows up or Sarah shows up the second time, then you take it down. Right?
You're part of the problem.
I am part of the problem because there's no solution. Because if you go in and ask the city, they just say, no, go away. Well, okay, but there's 50 of them across the city, right?
Yeah.
And so, if you can't beat them, join them. Like driving 10 miles over the speed limit. Everybody does it, so.
Yeah.
Can't
Yeah,
say
I
they
mean,
be-
we can certainly introduce some standards for those types of feather signs. Perhaps I think a lot of communities had like a minimum separation between the signs, a maximum number that you're allowed to have on a certain property. So like you said, at least there's some regulation, some standard in place to regulate them. So where it's not kind of a free for all like it may be today, and then doesn't become an enforcement burden for the city over time.
Right, make it a temporary sign that's allowed to be there for 30 days and a really high fee, and then you guys can use that for the city hall, the city employees, holiday party. Get some money out of it.
That's a fair point. I think we can address that.
Can get that built in.
Car dealerships with the inflatable signs. Yeah, I'm done. Promise. I'm gonna say very little about floodplain. I'm done.
All right.
Thank you.
So our next,
Signage is such a tough thing. I didn't even want to look at the proposed things, but yeah, I think it's well written and, that's appreciated because it is always a very emotional thing
Yeah.
through the approval process. And I've been in scenarios where a city is very heavy-handed and insists on one type of sign, and it just is a miserable battle watching, national companies trying to get their sign. So thank you.
yeah,
everybody.
trying to keep it as flexible as possible while still ensuring a minimum standard of design and quality so that the appearance of the community is really enhanced and maintained over time. So, okay. Our last chapter for the evening is the floodplain development standards. So there's a lot of reasons, of course, to have this chapter. It's essential to make sure we're not expending too much public money for flood control projects, minimizing rescue and relief efforts, helping to minimize business interruptions, damage to public facilities and utilities, et cetera, et cetera. We are not proposing any changes to these existing standards. They are being carried forward as is. The only change to the chapter is to take the definitions out of chapter 11 and consolidate them with the definitions chapter at the end of the ordinance, and then take the administrative processes out of the chapter and relocate them to the administrative chapter so that those are when you're looking at the code and you see administrative chapter, that's where at least my mind would automatically go to for all of the processes of the code. Same with definitions. So having them grouped together like that, I think will make the code a bit more user-friendly, easier to navigate. So we weren't going to go over any of the standards for Chapter 11 because they are not being proposed to change in any way. The engineering department was able to review these standards. There weren't any major changes that they thought were necessary. I think there was maybe some minor language cleanup here and there, but nothing that would really change the content of the standards or the regulations. But we're happy to answer any questions that you may have. We may need to bring those to the engineering department for their expertise in answering them, but yeah, certainly happy to answer any questions we can.
Yeah, the engineer is the floodplain administrator, so this chapter is completely out of my review. They
Yeah.
reviewed, they want to keep it as it is, so.
And they're following state and federal guidelines anyway, so I mean, this is a pretty,
Exactly.
this is a, yeah.
Yeah.
You couldn't change it if you wanted to.
Any questions on the answer? Okay. Good, we're good.
Awesome. So if there aren't any more questions on any of the chapters we've reviewed so far, can go ahead into our next steps. And so like I had mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, the next set of chapters that you all will receive for review and that we'll meet to go over are the final chapters for the code itself. So Chapter 1, Purpose and Applicability, Chapter 12, Administrative and Enforcement Procedures, 13, Nonconformities, and 14, Definitions. And then from there, we will pull together the full draft code, refined with all of the input that we've received from you all so far. We'll develop diagrams to help. A lot of the example diagrams that you all have seen included in the drafts will be made to be specific for Stow for the language that we're developing for the city. And we'll have a final meeting to go over all of the changes, make sure that the code reflects the feedback that we received from you all. And then I think in the meantime, Zach and Sarah will have some follow-up meetings with you all to talk through the building design standards and some of those other proposed requirements that there was some need for follow-up on to make sure that we were truly reflecting what's appropriate for Stow and what you all would like to see in this new code. So with that, I thank you all so much for your time this evening and in the last 2 weeks here. I know this is a lot of time to dedicate to this project, but we are moving right along. We're really making good time and should have the final chapters for you all to take a look at here in the next few weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is heavy rain.
Thank you all so much. Have a great evening.
Like.
Thanks, Jackie.